This is episode 13 of Chris Sweeney Talks To, and today I'm joined by Sean Clinton, who's a human rights activist with a very special interest and deep knowledge of the diamond industry. So thank you, Sean, for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for contacting me.
No problem at all. Well, I think the diamond industry is one of these things that a lot of people, we all know about it. We all understand that diamonds are in shops. A lot of people wear them as jewelry, but there's a murkier side, and I've been doing some talking with you recently, and that's why I wanted to have you on, that not everything is as it seems in the diamond industry. Is that fair to say? Oh,
that's perfectly fair to say. In fact, you know, the diamond industry, it relies on regulation by it's governed by a process of self-regulation known as the Kimberley Process, and that only looks at the rough diamonds in the mining sector, and it completely ignores cut and polished diamonds further along the supply chain. So when but obviously people who are buying diamonds are buying cut and polished diamonds. They don't buy rough diamonds. But the only regulations governing the diamond industry relates to the rough diamonds. Cut and polished diamonds are completely evade all regulation, provided they're in compliance with the Kimberley Process. Now, the Kimberley Process was set up came into force in 2003 as a result of bloody civil wars in Africa, in Angola and Sierra Leone in particular. Global Witness were the first ground trade, and the industry was forced to act to assuage public concerns about human rights violations linked to the diamond industry. So they eventually, when the industry was threatened with the introduction of regulations by governments, they eventually agreed to set up a system of self-regulation to govern the industry, whereby they would control the export of rough diamonds from the mines, each in packages, and they would have to be certified as in compliance with the Kimberley Process regulations. But what they did was, rather than banning all blood diamonds, they banned conflict diamonds. They introduced a new term called conflict diamonds. And these conflict diamonds are described as rough diamonds that fund rebel groups or their allies engaged in violence against legitimate governments. So it's only rough diamonds used by rebel groups that are controlled. All other diamonds that fund human rights violations evade regulation completely. But the diamond industry then uses the Kimberley Process to push this idea that diamonds are now somehow conflict-free, just because the rough diamonds, just because the eliminators or made it illegal for rebel groups to use the diamonds. But other government forces can still do use diamond revenue to fund human rights violations. And that is completely brushed under the carpet by the diamond industry. Totally.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's an important distinction, because I think a lot of people, you know, listening to this will be aware of the term blood diamonds. They're aware of the term conflict diamonds. But I think a lot of people will assume that they're the same thing. But like you're saying, they are not the same thing.
They're not, and it was a very clever trick by the diamond industry to come up with this new term called the conflict diamonds, and get the public to focus on conflict diamonds solely, and to ignore the other blood diamonds, because a lot of blood diamonds aren't actually conflict diamonds, because they're funding government violence, not rebel violence. So by focusing on rebel violence only, the jewelry industry is able to con the public by claiming that the diamonds are somehow conflict. In fact, what they do is they say that the Kimberley Process guarantees diamonds are conflict-free. But if you look at the Kimberley Process regulation, that term doesn't appear anywhere in the Kimberley Process regulations. So they can't possibly claim to guarantee a diamond is conflict-free. The industry recognized that there was this gaping hole in the regulations. And what they did was, the World Diamond Council, a body set up by leading jewelers, came up with this system of warranties that the jewelers would use. And it simply states that jewelers can use, anybody selling diamonds can issue on the certificate a statement saying that these diamonds are conflict-free to the best of their knowledge. Nothing more than that. And that is with the Kimberley Process, which, as I said, only regulates rough diamonds. When you're selling cut and polished diamonds that are funding war crimes, this by using the system of warranties, we're able to claim that the diamonds are conflict free. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a lot of people watching, will understand that now, that, there's a difference in a conflict diamond and a blood diamond. And once, it seems like what you're saying is that once the diamond is cut, polished, and enters the system, it could be any diamond. You don't know where it's come from. Once it's in that system, it's given the approval. Yeah. It's above board.
Yeah. It is, yeah, and even rough diamonds that are found in rogue regimes in Zimbabwe and Angola, they also evade the Kimberley Process regulations, and that really that came to light in 2008 when government forces in Zimbabwe killed 200 miners in the Morang area of Zimbabwe, and human rights organizations, Global Witness and Human Rights Watch, wanted the diamonds from the Morang area banned and called conflict diamonds. But they didn't fit the definition of a conflict diamond because the violence was carried out by government forces, not by rebels. So after 2 years of when the diamond experts from Morang were halted for administrative purposes, Global Witness or the Kimberley Process eventually certified that the blood diamonds from the Morang were allowed onto the international market because there weren't conflict diamonds. It was government forces that killed the 200 miners who wasn't rebels. So immediately after that, then Global Witness withdrew from the Kimberley Process. They had no faith in it after that. So here you had the agency that set up to prevent the trade of blood diamonds, certifying known blood diamonds and allowing them onto the international market, and then calling them conflict-free, which exposed the whole charade of the whole thing. Now, since then, human rights organizations have been pressing the Kimberley Process to broaden the definition of a conflict diamond to include diamonds that fund human rights violations by government forces and downstream of the mining sector. But in 2015, the World Diamond Council had a proposal on the table to do just that, but Israel blocked it. The CEO of the Israeli Diamond Exchange, Shmuel Snitcher, blocked the thing. He had a veto and he blocked it because he said it would be disastrous for Israel. So they blocked the reforms of the definition of a conflict diamond. And all members of the KP have a veto, so it's proved impossible to expand the definition to include human rights violations outside the mining sector. And these diamonds are still flooding onto the market labeled conflict-free. And that's what's happened in Ukraine today. We see that Russian diamonds, which are fully in compliance with the Kimberley Process, are funding grave human rights violations in Ukraine, yet they're in full compliance with the Kimberley Process, and they're supposed to be conflict-free. But that's causing problems for the industry right now.
Yeah.
The big problem is that if they ban Russian diamonds for funding grave human rights violations, they'll also have to ban Israeli diamonds for funding human rights violations. So they're caught in a bind of their own making, really.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Israel there, and that's something that I find really surprising and interesting, because for me, I did never appreciate that Israel was a big diamond exporter or had any diamonds, because I don't imagine there being mines in Israel. I don't imagine all the movies and documentaries I've seen. And there's some statistics. In 2010, Israel was the biggest exporter of diamonds in the world. Really? Between 2012 and 2016, it brought in 50 billion into their economy. There's huge numbers there. I think someone said it's worth 25 billion per year. It's their biggest export. I looked at statistics that you sent me that were there were third-party statistics between, and in the years 2008, 2014, it was by far the biggest export in Israel. So maybe you can tell people, how are Israel getting involved in the diamond process, because they're obviously not making the diamonds or finding the diamonds in their own land. No,
obviously not. Israel imports all of the rough diamonds from either Africa, from Russia, or from Canada. And they generally import about 5 billion worth of, they used to anyway, about 5 billion worth of rough diamonds. That's gone down in recent years, all right. And they would process those diamonds in Israel. In fact, they would grade them and sort them, and they would keep a certain amount for their own cutting and polishing industry. And they would re-export about 2/3 of those imported rough diamonds to cutting and polishing centers in India or China, Israeli companies in India or China, where cheap labor allows for the cutting and polishing of the smaller diamonds that are less valuable. But Israel will keep the larger diamonds, the more valuable diamonds, for cutting and polishing in Israel. And in that way, they're able to increase the value of the diamonds. They would import about, as I say, about 4 to 5 billion rough diamonds, but the export value could be up to 10 to 12 billion of the cut and polished and the rough diamonds combined. So the net value to Israel in 2014, it was 11 billion net added to the Israeli economy in diamond revenue. And in 2014, we all remember that war in Gaza had killed over 2,500 people, including over 550 children. That war in Gaza in 2014 was estimated to cost about 2.5 billion to the Israeli exchequer. But that year, the diamond industry added 11 billion net to the Israeli economy. And just 2 years ago, Netanyahu said that, or maybe it's 3 years ago now, Netanyahu said that the Israeli economy is the major source of funding for the Israeli military. It provides 88% of the funds needed to fund the Israeli military and Shin Bet and security forces. So, and the diamond industry has been described as a cornerstone of that economy. So it's a major source of revenue for the Israeli military. In fact, Shir Heber, the Israeli political economist, calculated in 2010 that the Israeli diamond industry generates approximately 1 billion per year in funding for the Israeli military. So he said that every time somebody buys a diamond that was exported from Israel, some of that money ends up in the Israeli military. So the connection, he said, is quite clear. There's a clear connection between the Israeli diamond industry and the Israeli military.
Yeah, and that brings us back to how we started this whole debate. We're talking about Israel, and it's obviously committing human rights violations across the board in Palestine. It's taking land. It's there's just so many things that Israel's doing egregiously against the Palestinians. But as you say, every time they sell a diamond, they're using that money to fund that action. So again, we're back to conflict versus blood diamonds. We're back in that same dilemma.
Yeah, the jewelers are then saying, "Oh, our diamonds aren't conflict diamonds. We're not selling blood diamonds. We're not selling any conflict diamonds, but they are selling blood diamonds. They just won't recognise the fact that diamonds downstream of the mining sector can also be blood diamonds. Blood diamonds aren't confined to the mining sector. If diamonds are funding grave human rights violations downstream of the mining sector, then their blood diamonds are every bit as bloody as the diamonds in the mines that are funding human rights violations."
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to ask you about was because in 2000, and I think it was about 2018, there was reports that the Israeli diamond exporting had fallen by 45%, and some of this was put on political pressure. The whole BDS boycott, divestment, sanctions, where people are stepping away. But then you actually did a bit of research, and you saw that there had been two sets of figures, for the actual amount of diamonds exported, and you spoke about it. Just read the quote very quickly, because the quote came back, and the person said to you, "Normally, when countries do a second publish, they announce it by issuing a message such as full revision, which did not happen this time." So Israel essentially announced two figures. Yeah. Announced the first one, and then instead of correcting it as this person said they normally would for the second one, they just put it out and stayed silent, showing that the diamond industry actually hadn't suffered as much as previously thought by the whole BDS and political pressure. Yeah,
that happened in 2018. I had published an article showing the decline in Israel's diamond industry over since 2014. In fact, it had declined very steeply. Far more steeply than other centres. There was a recession during some of those years, but the diamond industry had started to recover and had increased, in fact, in the latter years. But Israel's diamond industry kept on a trajectory downwards. And I wrote an article about that, and it was published by the Middle East Monitor. And a few months later, I discovered that the figures that I had quoted, they were changed by the International Trade Center. And when I contacted them, I asked them about this, how come the figures have changed? It says, they weren't changed. They told me they weren't changed, that they didn't publish two sets of figures. And they insisted on this in a series of emails, about 7 or 8 emails. They kept telling me that I had got it wrong, I had published the wrong data. But I had a screenshot of the original data. When I sent that to them, eventually I sent that to the screenshot of the original data, said, "Oh yes, we did actually publish two sets of data," but they didn't give any explanation as to why that happened. So it's still a mystery as to why that happened.
And is it, do you think most people realise? Because I mean, maybe I'm just the sort of the idiot in the room here, but do you think most people realise that Israel is a big player in the diamond world. I mean, I think it's maybe at the moment it's the fifth or sixth biggest player. And when you look at the size of the country, I mean, it's it really is a much more bigger impact in the diamond industry than the size of country you'd expect.
No, yeah, when people talk about Israel and they talk about the high technology, the computers and the pharmaceuticals, they never mention the diamonds. But there's a good reason for that. Israel's brand image is utterly toxic for the diamond brand image, because Israel's brand image is one of war and violence and bloodshed. And that doesn't go hand in hand with the diamond industry, which is one of love and romance. So they keep this very low key, very quiet. They're not going to say much about it, especially the jewelry industry. Certainly never mention the fact that their diamonds are cut and polished in Israel, or rarely at least, So it's for that reason, nobody is aware of the fact that Israel is such a major player in the global diamond industry. I certainly wasn't. In fact, what put me onto it was in 2006 with the War in Lebanon, the Israeli war in Lebanon, and it just dawned on me that how can this small country? It's not much bigger. Well, it's smaller than Ireland, but population-wise, it's kind of similar in size to Ireland. If you look at their data for their GDP and their imports, exports, and their economic activity, Ireland and Israel aren't in such. There isn't an awful lot of difference. And if it was up to Ireland to go fighting wars with our neighbours, like at the rate that Israel does, we just couldn't possibly afford it, or we couldn't afford a military the size of Israel, or we couldn't afford to develop an unregulated nuclear arsenal like Israel has done either. So I began to ask the question: well, where's the money coming from for funding that? And everybody has the idea that it's all funded by America. Well, when you look at the actual statistics of how much Israel spends on its military every year, it's about 19-20 billion. Okay, they get 3 billion from 3.5 billion from America, but that's not nearly enough. And then it comes down to the economy. It's the economy that funds this Israeli economy that funds the Israeli military, and a huge portion of that is their diamond industry. Because, like as I said, in 2014 they got over 11 billion net dollars as a result of diamond exports. And the military expenditure in that year was about 15 billion. So they got 11 billion from diamonds pumped into the Israeli economy. So that generates, when that goes into the Israeli economy, it generates further funds in the economy through other activities like.
Yeah. And another one, another country that seems to have popped up over the last kind of decade is the UAE, particularly Dubai. Yeah. And they seem to become, is it fair to say that they're almost seeing what Israel have done and thought, we'll have some of that, we'll do the same thing they're doing. Yeah,
they have surged ahead in the last decade, the UAE, and it's due to lax regulation in the UAE in particular. It's of course it's close to the diamond mines in Africa, and it's close to the cutting and polishing center in India and China as well. So it's geographically it's well located, but the lax regulation allowed for this practice of price transfer, where companies exporting diamonds from African countries could undervalue the value of the diamonds they were exporting to avoid paying tax. And then when it got into the free trade zone in UAE, they could revalue the diamonds back there. And in that way, they were creaming off huge amounts of profit from the African countries quite illegally. And this all was exposed years ago. But UAE has surged ahead, and they're now surpassed Tel Aviv as a major diamond trading hub. But Tel Aviv is still one of the third or fourth largest, probably the third largest diamond trading hub in the world at the moment. Still a major player in the diamond industry.
It seems to be, from the countries we're talking about, Israel, we're talking about the UAE, we're talking about some countries in Africa. And, I think maybe particularly UAE and Israel, their human rights records are abysmal or poor. Does being a diamond centre almost go hand in hand with human rights abuses and corruption? I mean, is that fair to say? There seems to be a connection.
Well, then you look at the other side of the globe, you got India and what they're doing in Kashmir. And India cuts and polishes about 90% of the diamonds in carat terms. That's in the weight and volume. But and no doubt about it, the revenue from the diamonds in India, it's very hard to say where can you get a diamond that's truly conflict free. I don't know if you can unless you look to a very specialized source for it. Of course, there's the lab grown diamonds are coming to the fore now, and young consumers are looking towards lab grown diamonds, which are more ethical in some sense anyway, and certainly more environmentally friendly. But of course, many lab-grown diamonds are sent to Israel for cutting and polishing. So that negates all the good they're doing by growing them, by not mining diamonds. If they're sending them to Israel to cut and polish, then revenue from those diamonds are also funding the Israeli industry. So it's you got to be careful where you pick your diamonds, where you get your diamonds from.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's something I'd like to ask you. You know, say I went out today in New York, London, Paris, San Francisco, whatever big city it may be, and I bought a diamond. How easy would it be for me to find out where that diamond had been all the way along the process to getting to the shop it's in?
It's nearly impossible at the moment. There are some diamonds, all right, that are being traced by blockchain, but the amount of information that's given to the individuals through the blockchain is very, because some of the information they regard as sensitive information, they won't disclose sensitive information for commercial reasons, they're saying. But in fact, they'll tell you the source of the diamond, where the diamond was mined, all right, but they may not tell you the full details of which companies have cut and polished it. So, and then they will tell you, oh, this was mined in a certain area and it's conflict free because it's compliant with the Kimberley process. But what happened after it left the diamond mine, you may not know. You may not be able to find out, because an awful lot of diamonds are processed in Israel. About 4 to 5 billion diamonds go to Israel every year, the rough diamonds, and they could go to companies in India or China afterwards. You know, some of them are cutting and polishing. So it's very difficult. It's almost impossible to trace diamonds. Most jewelers probably wouldn't have an idea, because diamonds get mixed in parsons. They're all mixed together in different trading centers. And once a diamond leaves a mine, and let's say a rough diamond ends up in Israel, then if it's re-exported from Israel with another KP certificate, it loses the trace back to the mine. It's then regarded as an Israeli diamond. The KP certificate will say the origin is from Israel. You know.
Yeah.
So it's oftentimes it's very difficult to trace where diamonds because they're all mixed in bundles, and it's impossible to trace them.
And it seems,
it's very difficult.
In your opinion, is that kind of confusion, murky waters of where diamonds are from? Does the industry want that then? Do they want the consumer to have a hard time, tracing back where things have been, and it's all very opaque?
Yes, of course. There's a lot of cover up going on, and like big companies like De Beers and Tiffany's, and those Tiffany's, they cut and polish a lot of their own diamonds in their own factories around the world. But they also buy in approximately 25% of their cut and polished diamonds from other companies. But they haven't disclosed where they are coming from. Now, they're saying that they're going to put in place a system where they will disclose that. But up until a few years ago, Tiffany's were buying diamonds from a mine in Sierra Leone owned by Benny Steinmetz of the Benny Steinmetz Group Resources. And Benny Steinmetz Group Resources has adopted a unit of the Israeli military called the Givati Brigade, which they funded and supported during the 2008-2009 war in Gaza. During this time, the Givati Brigade were responsible for the massacre of the Samudi family, a war crime documented by several human rights organizations, including the UN Human Rights Council, B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International. Where about 40 members of the Samudi family were corralled into a house, and the house was shelled, killing about 100 members of the family were corralled in the house, and the house was shelled, killing about 30 to 40 members of the family. The exact details I haven't got here beside me at the moment, but it was recognized as a war crime by the UN Human Rights Council. They documented that, and that crime was committed by the Givati Brigade, which was funded and supported by the Steinmetz Group, which at the time was a customer or a partner of Tiffany & Co, and also a partner of De Beers, the world's largest diamond company. And actually, shortly after that, the Steinmetz Diamond Group is also a partner of Sotheby's, the big auction house. So those three companies, De Beers, Sotheby's, and Tiffany's, were all involved with during that operation in Gaza, and through the Steinmetz Diamond Group. And in 2012, then the Steinmetz Diamond Group put a specimen diamond in the Tower of London in honor of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. And the In Mines human rights group in London protested outside the tower, raising awareness about this. And in fact, one of the Simoni family in Gaza recorded a video appealing to the Queen to have the diamond removed because they regarded it as a blood diamond because it was couldn't polish by a company that funded the Givati Brigade. So the diamond was removed a few months later. And then in 2013, Sotheby's auctioned the famous Steinmetz pink diamond for a world record $84 million. And a few months prior to that, I had written to the CEO of Sotheby's, informing him about the risk to the brand and reputation by their partnership with the Steinmetz Diamond Group. And I didn't get a response from him. But 4 months after the auction, the diamond was thrown back at Sotheby's, and by the group of investors who had bought it, and they weren't penalised. Sotheby's had to take it back into their own inventory because of a pre-auction agreement with the seller. So they ended up losing about 10 million on that transaction because I believe it was because the diamond was tarnished by the massacre of the Simoni family.
It's unbelievable. You're going through this sort of. I was going to say, it's almost a role of dishonor. It's unbelievable so much goes on in the diamond industry. In terms of getting the diamonds, from Africa, why do these sort of countries, maybe like Israel, the UAE, why do they get so many diamonds from there? Is it just they're willing to pay more? Are they willing to sort of go along with certain practices and put money in certain pockets? Is that why it goes there as opposed to maybe more legitimate places?
The mining companies, there's a number of mining, just really a handful of major mining companies, and they control, like De Beers control a lot of the mines in South Africa and in Botswana, or they're in partnership with Botswana in Botswana. These large mining companies then send their rough diamonds to processing centers in Antwerp and in Tel Aviv and in Dubai, where they're distributed to other centers, to cut-in polishing centers then around the globe, mainly in India and in Israel and in Antwerp as well. So that's fairly straightforward, the fact that they get the diamonds from the African countries, or from Canada or from Russia. And these trading hubs, there's 4 or 5 trading hubs, and that's where the diamonds are all processed through,
Yeah.
So that's there's nothing unusual about that as such.
Yeah. And just sort of finally, Sean, I wanted to ask you, for anyone thinking about buying a diamond, or maybe in the future may buy a diamond, what would you say to them?
I'd say be very careful. What I would say is you don't really need that diamond. It's only a piece of polished carbon, for God's sake. And buy something else. Put your deposit on a house or something that will increase in value, not a diamond. Because as soon as you walk out of that shop, you're losing money big time, and you've been conned. There's nothing special about that. Go and find a pebble on the beach, which actually. There's another story. Somebody else I know who did that, found a nice pebble and got it polished and made a special diamond, made a special ring out of it. But I think it must be one of the worst investments a young couple can make is to buy a diamond. It's especially when the history of the diamonds is so tarnished by bloodshed and continues to be tarnished by bloodshed and violence, and the way the industry refuses to expand the definition of a concrete diamond, continuously refuses to expand the definition, and continuously allows diamonds that are funding grave human rights violations by rogue regimes to flood the market and have them labeled conflict free. You just can't trust the industry, I'm afraid, and that's just the bottom line. You cannot trust the industry.
And how far, and my final very quick question, how far do you think we are away from getting to a situation where people ethically, diamonds can be bought and people can appreciate where they're from and they're not funding any rogue regimes? Are we in sight of that, or do you think that is decades and decades and decades away?
I think that's a good way. I think that the lab created diamonds, maybe there is a hope that with some of those being cut and polished in areas that aren't in countries that aren't abusing human rights, there's a possibility for that. But I think we're a long way away from a situation where people can buy with confidence. I don't see it as not on the immediate horizon right now. And the industry is still in denial. They're refusing to admit that there's any human rights violations occurring downstream of the mining sector. They only want to focus on the mining sector. They won't look beyond the mine gate. And unfortunately, the NGOs that are involved in reporting this, Human Rights Watch, in fact, published a very detailed report back 2 or 3 years ago about the diamond industry. But once again, their examination stopped at the mine gate. They weren't considering human rights violations occurring outside the mining sector, being funded by revenue outside the mining sector.
Yeah, well,
so it's really difficult to say that can buy with confidence at this stage. Buy something different. Invest your money somewhere else.
Well, that's the message from. That's the message.
Okay.
I was going to say that's the message from Sean Clinton. Save your money, don't buy a diamond, and buy something else. But thank you so much for joining me today. Just before I go, I'll mention your Twitter. You're at War Diamonds, and you're on there quite a lot. You put a lot of information out. You kind of talk about stuff in the industry. So for people looking to find out more and sort of keep up to date, they should give you a follow on there because you're quite prolific.
Well, there's always something happening in the diamond field of interest. There's always something popping up. Yeah, okay, Chris. Yeah. Listen, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed talking to you, and hopefully it'll raise some awareness with some people out there.
Thank you very much, Sean. Nice to speak to you.